In the pre-dawn darkness of August 21, 1942, roughly 200 Japanese soldiers emerged from the shadows and began their assault across the narrow sand spit at Alligator Creek on Guadalcanal. The moonlit beach stretched before them like an invitation, and they charged forward with the confidence of men who believed victory was already theirs. American machine gunners crouched in their positions, watching the approaching figures move through their weapon sights. 20 yards, 15 yards, 10 yards. The distance closed steadily. Soon, the Marines could make out individual faces in the pale light. They could hear the sound of boots striking sand, the breathing of exertion, the rattle of equipment. Close enough now that Japanese soldiers could begin hurling grenades toward the Marine lines. Everything in a Marine's training screamed at them to open fire immediately. Every defensive manual insisted on engaging targets at maximum effective range. Every veteran in those positions knew the fundamental rule of warfare: never ever allow the enemy to get this close. Yet tonight, something entirely different was unfolding. The Marines held their fire. They were abandoning every principle their military instructors had drilled into them, because Major General Alexander Vandergrift had transformed this battle into something altogether unprecedented, a problem of pure mathematics and precision engineering. The killing zone they had prepared was a marvel of calculated lethality. Pre-registered artillery coordinates marked every point on the beach. Machine gun fields of fire interlocked with geometric precision, each weapon covering the gaps left by its neighbors, and waiting in the darkness like giant shotgun shells were 37mm canister rounds, each one packed with 122 steel balls ready to be unleashed. The Japanese soldiers approaching that night had absolutely no conception of what awaited them. They believed they were about to overwhelm another hastily assembled American garrison through sheer determination and superior night-fighting tactics. They were walking straight into the most meticulously engineered killing field the Marine Corps had ever created. Sometimes allowing your enemy to advance unopposed isn't a desperate mistake. Sometimes it's the perfect trap. General Kiyonao Ichiki stood on the deck of the destroyer Kagero as it cut through the dark waters toward Guadalcanal. His mind was consumed by a fever that had gripped the Imperial Army since that December morning at Pearl Harbor. Japanese commanders everywhere had begun calling it victory fever, that intoxicating certainty that American forces would simply crumble under any determined assault, just as Chinese troops had broken across a dozen different battlefields. Ichiki carried with him the weight of opportunities lost. His regiment had been earmarked for the assault on Midway, an operation that would have restored Japanese momentum throughout the entire Pacific theater. That mission had been cancelled, leaving his men hungry for a spectacular victory that would demonstrate Japanese military superiority once and for all. The intelligence reports seemed encouraging. Reconnaissance photographs from August 12th showed minimal American activity around Henderson Field. When Ichiki's advance elements landed near Taivu Point on August 18th, positioned some 25 miles east of the Marine defensive lines, radio messages came back with confidence. No hostile forces encountered. Operations proceeding according to schedule. Higher command had assessed American strength on Guadalcanal at perhaps 3,000 men, scattered, demoralized, still recovering from their initial landing. The calculation seemed elementary. Ichiki commanded 917 hand-picked troops from the 28th Infantry Regiment. A swift nocturnal assault would crush whatever skeleton crew the Americans had left defending their airfield. What Ichiki couldn't have known was that Major General Alexander Vandergrift commanded approximately 11,000 Marines distributed across the island. More importantly, Vandergrift had spent the preceding 2 weeks completely revolutionizing how American defensive operations functioned. Changes that would have seemed almost heretical to officers trained in conventional Marine combat doctrine. Traditional Marine manuals prioritized aggressive assault and rapid tactical movement. Vandergrift was implementing something radically different: defensive warfare conceived as precision engineering, as mathematical problem-solving rather than warrior spirit. The transformation began with how Vandergrift studied the terrain. He examined every approach to Henderson Field with the methodical precision of a civil engineer rather than a conventional military strategist. The jungle geography itself naturally funneled any attack from the eastern approaches toward a single choke point, the mouth of Alligator Creek, where a narrow sand spit represented the only practical crossing during low tide. North of this point, the open ocean provided no shelter for any attacking force. To the south, impenetrable jungle made large-scale unit movement virtually impossible. Any substantial attack from the east had to come across that sand spit. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock commanded the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines positioned to defend this approach. He'd initially struggled with Vandergrift's unconventional defensive philosophy. Marine doctrine had always emphasized aggressive fire and maneuver, pushing forward to meet the enemy as far from your own position as possible. Yet Vandergrift's concept called for something that seemed almost counterintuitive, something almost passive, allowing enemy forces to approach within grenade-throwing distance before unleashing your firepower. The psychological toll on individual Marines would be staggering. Every instinct would demand engaging targets from maximum range. Every Marine's conditioning would rebel against waiting until Japanese soldiers were close enough to see their expressions clearly. However, as Pollock repeatedly walked those defensive positions, checking weapon placement and fields of fire day after day, the elegant logic of Vandergrift's design gradually became apparent. This wasn't passive defense at all. This was warfare stripped down to its mathematical essence. Water-cooled M1917A1 Browning machine guns were positioned so their fields of fire interlocked perfectly. Each crew would defend their assigned sector while neighboring weapons eliminated every gap. Mortar concentrations and artillery fires from the 11th Marines had been pre-registered during daylight hours, their coordinates measured and recorded so gun crews could deliver accurate fire in total darkness. Most crucial of all were the 37mm M3 anti-tank guns, loaded with M2 canister rounds, each projectile containing 122 steel balls that would transform the sand spit into an instrument of concentrated devastation. The discipline required defied everything Marines had been trained to accept. Machine gun crews were accustomed to engaging targets at distances of 400 to 600 yards whenever possible. Vandergrift's order required them to wait until Japanese forces closed to within 30 yards, close enough that enemy soldiers could throw grenades. Close enough that raw human nerve would be tested to its absolute limit. But at that distance, those 37mm canister rounds would function exactly like enormous shotgun blasts, each capable of cutting down multiple attackers simultaneously. Private First Class Franks Pomeroy manned one of the water-cooled Brownings positioned along the creek line. During the days leading up to the attack, he'd struggled to reconcile this revolutionary doctrine with everything the Marine Corps had taught him about warfare. The M1917A1 could maintain cyclic rates of 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Its water jacket prevented the barrel from overheating during the extended firefights that this new doctrine made inevitable. But firing at such close range meant accepting a brutal reality. Some Japanese soldiers would inevitably reach Marine positions before being killed. The entire plan depended on absolute confidence in overlapping fields of fire and complete faith in the stopping power of canister rounds. Company G of the 1st Marines had been assigned as the mobile reserve force, positioned to launch counterattacks against any Japanese breakthrough before it could expand into something unstoppable. This represented perhaps the most psychologically demanding assignment in Vandergrift's entire defensive strategy. While other Marines would at least experience the release of firing their weapons, Company G would remain in reserve, forced to trust that the killing zone would function exactly as designed, maintaining vigilant readiness to attack immediately if any Japanese forces somehow penetrated the main defensive line. As August 20th transformed into August 21st, Coast Watchers transmitted urgent intelligence confirming that substantial Japanese forces were moving westward along the coastal road. The Marines settling into their defensive positions along Alligator Creek had no way of knowing they were about to participate in a tactical experiment that would ultimately transform American defensive doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. They knew only that their commanding general had ordered them to violate everything their training had taught them, to allow the enemy to approach closer than any Marine manual had ever suggested possible, and to trust mathematics and engineering over instinct and immediate reaction. The terrain itself determined the geometry of death. Pollock had invested countless hours studying the precise ground where Alligator Creek met the ocean, understanding that successful defensive engineering had to begin with reading the landscape as you would read an engineering blueprint. The creek traced a natural barrier running generally north-south before curving eastward to empty into the sea. Along the western bank where the Marines had constructed their main resistance line, the ground sloped slightly upward, offering excellent observation across the narrow sand spit, the only practical crossing point when tide levels were low. The open ocean to the north provided no concealment whatsoever for any attacking force. South of their positions, dense jungle created an almost impenetrable wall against large unit movement. Any genuine assault from the east would inevitably funnel into a compressed killing zone no wider than 50 yards. Pollock had positioned his machine guns with extraordinary precision. Each M1917A1 Browning was sighted to cover specific sectors of fire, while overlapping completely with neighboring weapons, eliminating any dead space where attackers might find shelter. The water-cooled barrels could endure the sustained firing that this revolutionary defensive concept demanded, unlike air-cooled weapons that would fail from overheating during prolonged engagements. Each gun crew had invested days in meticulous preparation, measuring exact distances to prominent features on the landscape and positioning their aiming stakes to mark carefully planned target points. Once darkness fell and vision became impossible, the machine gunners could swing their weapons to these pre-calibrated spots and unleash accurate fire based entirely on precise calculations instead of what their eyes could confirm. Vandergrift's overall defensive strategy included artillery support that stood among the most methodical fire plans the Marine Corps had ever put to the test in actual combat. The observers with the 11th Marines had marked concentration zones across the eastern side of Alligator Creek, recording exact distances and directional bearings in broad daylight. These numbers went onto maps in the artillery command post, letting gun crews positioned well back from the fighting to send accurate rounds downrange in total darkness. Night artillery was no longer a matter of luck or guesswork. It had become a science of careful measurement and timing. When forward observers requested fire on these pre-established positions, artillery crews simply set their guns to the numbers already calculated and fired. They could trust their shells would land in exactly the right spot. The 37mm anti-tank guns presented perhaps the most creative part of this whole defensive setup. These weapons were built to stop enemy tanks, yet they were being used in a completely different role that made full use of their distinctive strengths. Each M3 gun carried M2 canister rounds, projectiles packed with 122 small steel balls inside. When the gun fired, these rounds worked precisely like massive shotgun shells, spraying destruction across a wide area and bringing down multiple targets at once. Between 20 and 30 yards out, canister rounds achieved their fullest potential. The individual steel balls stayed dangerous across great distance, while spreading enough to cover the whole span of the sandbar where attackers would cross. The demands this defensive plan placed on individual soldiers went beyond anything their training had really prepared them for. Private First Class Roy and his machine gun crew had run through these maneuvers many times, but actually allowing armed enemy fighters to get close enough to hurl grenades struck at every basic instinct about survival. The M1917A1 machine gun could reach targets out to 800 or even 1,000 yards under perfect conditions. Yet the plan demanded holding fire until Japanese forces reached just 30 yards away. That meant accepting that certain attackers would definitely close the distance enough to throw grenades or storm individual positions before bullets could bring them down. Everything came down to whether Marines could follow orders and show fire discipline when every nerve in their body was screaming to shoot. Every weapon had its particular job within the larger defensive pattern. The 37mm guns would wait and strike only when Japanese soldiers reached the marked kill zone on the sandspit. Machine gunners would stay silent until the canister rounds had done their work, then rake the area with overlapping fields of fire to cut down survivors who pushed forward. Artillery would pound the far bank to stop reinforcements joining the main assault. The timing needed to be absolutely perfect. Starting too early meant Japanese units could scatter and find shelter. Waiting too long risked the position getting overrun before defensive fires could do their job. Company G, stationed as the rapid reaction force, formed the final piece of Vandegrift's entire defensive structure. Should Japanese attackers break through the main positions despite the heavy concentration of fire, Company G would strike back hard and fast to seal the breach before the enemy could dig in and hold what they'd taken. This meant the reserve company had to wait in sheltered locations, prepared to move instantly while putting faith in the frontline positions to funnel any breakthrough into killing zones where counterattacks would work best. Beyond just positioning guns, the defensive design included careful planning for ammunition and resupply. Each machine gun location had been built up with enough ammunition for extended firing, but gunners had orders to fire in controlled bursts rather than holding the trigger. The water-cooled barrels could manage heavy firing, yet ammunition needed to stay managed carefully. Artillery positions had stockpiled extra rounds close by, with set firing schedules showing how many rounds each pre-registered position would receive. The 37mm guns carried only limited canister rounds, making the choice of targets and the moment to shoot absolutely critical. As August 20th turned to darkness, Marines settling into spots along Alligator Creek grasped that they were about to put into practice a defensive idea that challenged everything the Corps normally believed about tactics and movement. Vandegrift's plan would succeed through organized precision and mathematical discipline, not through individual acts of bravery or aggressive tactics. Every Marine had to believe his specific role in this larger geometric pattern would make the defense work as a calculated, predictable system. The mental strain was crushing, but the plan itself was mathematically sound. Then mathematics would confront actual warfare at arm's length. At 3:10 in the morning, on August 21st, splashing sounds echoed across the narrow sandbar as roughly 200 Japanese soldiers began their assault crossing toward Alligator Creek. Private First Class Pomeroy looked through the rear sight of his M1917A1 Browning, spotting dark silhouettes pushing out from the jungle and moving forward across the beach lit by moonlight. The water-cooled gun sat loaded and prepared, its aiming mechanisms already locked onto the assigned field of fire. Everything in Pomeroy's mind screamed to fire immediately, to mow down the advancing soldiers while they stood out against pale sand and dark water. Yet Pomeroy kept his finger off the trigger, maintaining the discipline that Lieutenant Colonel Pollock had hammered into every Marine holding the line. The Japanese soldiers advanced, believing they were executing a successful surprise assault. Their voices drifted across the water gap as officers gave quiet commands and soldiers tried to stay together while moving through the creek's uncertain bottom. Deeper spots made some men stumble, their equipment banging and clattering as they fought to stay upright. Others moved more steadily, clearly men who had done this in China during earlier campaigns, where this exact method had repeatedly broken Chinese defenses. The attackers had no concept they were stepping into a precisely engineered killing zone. Every yard they covered brought them deeper into the center of the Marines' deadly crossfire, where multiple gunfields would combine with maximum lethality. 25 yards from the western bank. 20 yards now. 15 yards. Japanese soldiers at the front were close enough that Marines could make out facial features in the pale moonlight. Close enough to hear the breathing of men convinced they were about to overwhelm another American position through better training and superior night combat skills. At 10 yards, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock shouted the order that would prove whether months of preparation meant anything at all. Fire. The command traveled down the defensive positions in a sharp, controlled call that unleashed the fiercest concentration of firepower the Marine Corps had ever delivered at such short distance. The M3 37mm guns exploded first. Their canister rounds tearing across the sand spit like tremendous shotgun blasts. Each canister shell scattered 122 steel balls in a spreading pattern of devastation across the landing zone, striking multiple soldiers at once with overwhelming violence. The result was instant and overwhelming. Japanese soldiers who seconds before had been driving forward became scattered across the wet sand. The momentum of their charge shattered by the exact moment the canister rounds struck, but the Marine defense system was only starting to execute. When the 37mm guns released their first rounds, The M1917A1 machine guns opened fire with interlocking patterns, covering every part of the killing zone. Pomeroy squeezed his trigger and felt his water-cooled weapon vibrate as it fired at its steady rate of 450 rounds per minute. His gun's aiming mechanism letting him sweep his sector, while other crews eliminated the spaces between. What had begun as a disciplined Japanese assault evaporated into complete disorder as mathematical precision in American defensive fires took hold. Soldiers who had endured the initial canister blast found themselves caught in crossing machine gun streams that left no safe routes, no covered ground, no path back to the far side of the creek. The geometric elegance of Vandergrift's plan was expressing itself in the cruelest possible way. Yet even this overwhelming firepower could not stop every attacker. Some Japanese troops, pushed by their training and driven by desperation, kept moving through the defensive fires and made it to the western bank. A handful breached individual fighting positions, using bayonets and grenades to carve small gaps in the line. For one moment, the geometric precision of the defense appeared threatened by unpredictable human factors and the random luck that sometimes lets men survive. This exact situation was what Vandergrift and Pollock had prepared for. Company G, waiting behind the main line, got orders to attack immediately. The reserve Marines moved with the efficiency of practiced drills, their movement covered by continued machine gun fire that prevented Japanese forces from grouping together or holding the positions they had seized. The counterattack struck hard and fast, erasing the handful of Japanese soldiers who had reached the western side before they could establish any real presence or alert reinforcements waiting across the water. The mathematics of defensive systems were demonstrating themselves live, yet the fighting was only beginning. With Company G securing the main line again, Japanese mortars and 70mm guns, positioned on the eastern bank, began raining shells on Marine positions. The enemy command, realizing their initial assault had come apart, attempted to hammer the American positions with indirect fire long enough to prepare a second wave. Mortar explosions crashed through Marine fighting positions. The blasts flashed brief and violent across the beach, revealing the scale of Japanese losses scattered over the sand. Marines holding their spots had to endure the mental torture of mortar fragments cutting through air above them, while 70mm shells impacted along their line. Pomeroy stayed hunched over his machine gun, watching his assigned sector for signs of another assault, while trying not to think about the explosions that seemed to drift closer with each volley. The water jacket of his M1917A1 grew uncomfortably warm as the sustained firing continued, but the cooling system kept working exactly as designed, letting him maintain steady, accurate shots without the barrel overheating disasters that plagued air-cooled weapons. The first phase of fighting at Alligator Creek had shown just how devastating Vandergrift's carefully engineered defensive positions could be, yet both commanders knew this night was far from finished. The Japanese still held the eastern bank, and their artillery fire suggested they were preparing for another wave of attacks. The Marines had proven their defensive strategy worked at close quarters, but the real test, mathematical precision versus traditional Japanese assault tactics, was still ahead. The second assault came with methodical planning from officers convinced they'd figured out what went wrong before. Another company of roughly 150 men approached that same narrow sandbar where their comrades had been cut down just minutes earlier. Instead of seeing the fundamental problem with their approach, these Japanese commanders decided they simply hadn't sent enough troops in tight enough formation. They believed sheer numbers in better coordination would crack the American lines. They pushed forward with grim confidence, certain that a larger, more organized wave would bulldoze through. Private First Class Pomeroy peered through his machine gun sight as the new assault took shape, watching how the advancing enemy soldiers carefully stepped around the corpses scattered across the sand. This formation looked sharper than the first attack. Officers kept better control, and soldiers moved in tighter lines. Yet from his position behind the M1917A1, Pomeroy grasped something the attacking Japanese could not. They were moving straight into a killing zone that had been sharpened and perfected by the previous engagement. The 37mm gun crews had reloaded with fresh canister rounds. Artillery observers had confirmed their preset firing coordinates remained dead accurate. Machine gunners had adjusted their aiming points based on hard lessons from the first wave. When the second group reached that same mathematical sweet spot that had triggered the earlier slaughter, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock gave the order to open fire. This time, the result proved even more terrible. The 37mm canister rounds, perfectly aimed at the densest cluster of enemy soldiers, created overlapping cones of destruction that swept across the entire width of the sandbar. Japanese troops who'd advanced with such careful formation precision were mowed down en masse by steel balls that stayed lethal at that short distance. Survivors of the canister fire faced immediate machine gun fire from crews who'd spent the interval between attacks perfecting target selection and shot distribution. The mathematical elegance of Vandergrift's defensive plan revealed its cruelest edge. Every engagement made the system deadlier. The Marine gunners were learning to coordinate their fire with growing precision, closing the tiny gaps and timing delays that had let a handful of Japanese reach the western bank during the first assault. The kill zone was becoming perfectly calibrated with each test, shifting from theoretical engineering into ruthless practical execution of defensive warfare that left zero room for individual heroics or improvisation. As dawn approached, Japanese commanders attempted a desperate maneuver, showing both tactical creativity and catastrophic misunderstanding. Rather than continuing to assault that heavily fortified sandbar crossing, they ordered troops to move north along the beach and try sweeping around the Marine left flank through the surf beyond the breakers. The idea showed sophisticated thinking. By moving through chest-deep water, attackers would bypass the concentrated defensive fires that had proven so lethal at the creek mouth. But the Japanese flanking attempt only showed how thoroughly Vandergrift's planning had anticipated every possible route forward. Marines positioned at the northern end of their line had clear sightlines and open fields of fire reaching well into the surf zone. Japanese soldiers struggling through chest-deep water, rifles held overhead to keep dry, became perfect targets for machine gunners engaging them at ranges where the M1917A1s performed with maximum accuracy. The attacking troops moved slowly through the swells, unable to find cover or fire back while fighting to keep their footing. Artillery concentrations pre-registered for exactly this scenario began pounding among the Japanese at 0400 hours, and again at 0515, explosive shells throwing up geysers of water and sand that added chaos to men already struggling to hold formation. Machine gun fire from multiple positions converged on the exposed flanking force, cutting down soldiers who had nothing but water between them and incoming rounds, water that slowed them and made them easier marks. The flanking attempt, which might have succeeded against a conventional defensive line, became another mathematical demonstration of how geometric precision could neutralize tactical innovation. When daylight fully arrived, Major General Vandergrift ordered the final phase of his defensive plan to execute. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell, began moving upstream to cross Alligator Creek at a shallow ford roughly 3,000 yards inland from the coastal fighting. This maneuver represented the full realization of Vandergrift's engineering approach to combat. Having used defensive fires to pin and destroy the enemy assault waves, he was now throwing mobile forces forward to collapse the entire Japanese position through encirclement. Cresswell's battalion crossed the upper creek unopposed and swept down the eastern bank, their advance covered by the same pre-registered artillery fires that had supported the defensive phase. The enveloping force moved with deliberate precision, their advance protected by the identical artillery concentrations that had sustained the night's defense. Roughly 3,000 yards inland, the Marines wheeled toward the beach, trapping the surviving Japanese in a shrinking pocket with no escape except through that same killing zone. The arrival of Marine tanks crossing the sand in daylight completed Vandergrift's integrated approach. The armor, held back during the night fighting to prevent friendly fire incidents in darkness, now moved across contested ground, providing direct fire support for infantry. One tank hit a Japanese mine, but surviving tanks added mobile firepower that could engage targets and systematically clear enemy positions. At 1200 hours, Marine Fighter Squadron 223, which had arrived at Henderson Field on August 20th, made their first interception and started strafing runs that sealed the remaining escape paths along the beach. The coordination of air support with ground tactics demonstrated how Vandergrift's defensive engineering had smoothly transitioned into offensive operations, maintaining the same mathematical precision that had defined the night's defensive triumph. By 1700 hours, organized Japanese resistance had stopped, and the mathematical revolution in American defensive doctrine had achieved complete tactical success. When daylight broke on August the 22nd, the mathematical exactness of Vandergrift's defensive engineering could be calculated in cold numerical facts that would transform American tactical thinking throughout the Pacific War. Between 774 and 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead across the sandbar and surrounding beaches, their bodies scattered in patterns that demonstrated the geometric perfection of overlapping machine gun fire and canister rounds. Only 15 members of Colonel Ichiki's assault force were captured alive, mostly wounded men too hurt to continue. Against these losses, American casualties totaled between 34 and 44 killed, with roughly 75 wounded. The kill ratio at the sandbar itself reached approximately 20 Japanese deaths for each American killed, a mathematical vindication of defensive engineering that surpassed even Vandergrift's most hopeful predictions. The fate of Colonel Ichiki became symbolic of the collision between traditional Japanese offensive doctrine and American defensive innovation. Multiple accounts stated that the regimental commander took his own life after seeing his assault force annihilated, though some historical records contained ambiguity about the precise circumstances. What remained certain was that an elite Japanese officer, successful across Asia, could not adapt his tactical thinking to overcome a defensive system grounded in mathematical principles rather than traditional military courage. This defeat's psychological weight would reverberate through Japanese command, challenging fundamental beliefs about American fighting ability and defensive determination. Private First Class Pomeroy, examining his M1917A1 in the battle's aftermath, found the water-cooled barrel still warm from the sustained firing that defined the night's engagement. The mathematical precision of defensive fire had been proven, not merely in casualty figures, but in the mechanical performance of weapons functioning exactly to their engineering specifications. The cooling system had prevented barrel failure despite continuous firing at cyclic rates that would have destroyed air-cooled weapons. Pre-registered artillery had impacted within yards of intended targets throughout the night, demonstrating that mathematical fire control could achieve accuracy. No individual gunner could match through sight alone. The Battle of Alligator Creek's implications extended far beyond a single night's fighting. Major General Vandergrift had demonstrated that modern warfare rewarded systematic engineering over individual heroism, that defensive positions built with mathematical rigor could achieve results traditional military thinking considered impossible. The tactic of allowing enemy forces to approach within grenade range before opening fire contradicted every Marine Corps manual and training doctrine. Yet it had produced the most decisive tactical victory American forces had achieved since arriving in the Pacific. 3 weeks later, the Alligator Creek template would face its ultimate examination when roughly 3,000 Japanese troops under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi launched coordinated assaults against Marine positions on what would be remembered as Edson's Ridge. Fighting from September 12th through 14th would apply Vandergrift's defensive engineering principles on a far larger scale. Prepared positions, pre-registered artillery, interlocking machine gun zones, and disciplined fire control would again prove decisive against Japanese night tactics. Kawaguchi's assault forces would suffer between 700 and 800 killed, while inflicting roughly 100 American deaths, depending on source materials consulted. The mathematical relationship between defensive engineering and tactical victory remained constant even as combat scale increased dramatically. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, walking the contested ground, where his battalion had executed Vandergrift's groundbreaking defensive scheme, understood they'd been part of something transcending a single tactical engagement. The precision of overlapping fire, the effectiveness of pre-registered artillery, the devastating effect of canister rounds at close distance had shown that warfare could be expressed in mathematical terms when commanders possessed discipline to execute systematic engineering principles. The psychological hurdle of permitting armed enemy soldiers to approach within yards of positions, had been overcome through training and faith in geometric precision rather than individual courage. The battle's broader strategic implications would shape American defensive doctrine across the Pacific theater. Island garrisons from Tarawa to Iwo Jima would adopt lessons from Alligator Creek, employing mathematical fire planning and geometric positioning to accomplish tactical results conventional defensive thinking never could. The practice of exchanging ground for mathematical certainty, drawing enemy forces into predetermined kill zones where defensive fire achieved peak effectiveness, would become routine for American forces confronting Japanese assault tactics. Jacob Vuza, the Solomon Islander, whose intelligence had enabled Marines to prepare their defensive trap with such precision, represented the human component making mathematical warfare possible. His capture and torture by Japanese forces, followed by escape and warning to American commanders, had supplied the tactical intelligence necessary to implement Vandegrift's defensive engineering at the critical moment and location. Without Vuza's information regarding Japanese strength and intended approach routes, the geometric perfection of the Marine defensive scheme might have been wasted on empty terrain. The deepest lesson from Alligator Creek was perhaps most significant. They had succeeded because they transformed a night attack into a numerical problem and solved it at 20 yards. Conventional military wisdom stressed meeting enemy forces as far forward as feasible, engaging targets at maximum effective distance, preventing enemies from reaching close combat range. Vandegrift's revolutionary approach had deliberately rejected every principle of traditional defensive doctrine, using mathematical precision to convert close-range fighting from a test of individual courage into a solved equation where geometric placement and coordinated fire guaranteed tactical victory. The era of defensive engineering had commenced, and it would remake infantry combat throughout the war's remainder.